So this is where we get to the identification of the immediate cause. So train 1 Juliet 25 passed its authorized stopping position and entered a single line occupied by approaching train 1 Sierra 71. That's the trigger. The train slipped into the path of the train coming up the hill. That's not that useful or interesting. We don't really learn anything from that, and that is kind of why why Bedford is worth mentioning loosely, is because the RIRB have published today what we know about it, and really what they've done is identify the immediate cause. That is not hugely useful. It doesn't give us much insight. So at this point, there's not much that we can say, which is why that's the limit of what the discussion is going to be really on Bedford. So causal factors is what resulted in, get rid of one or more of these and the accident doesn't happen. So let's see. The approach of train 1 Juliet 25 to the block marker. So the train was unable to stop at that block marker. So it's a block marker rather than a signal, because it's in-cab control rather than conventional signaling. So these are block markers rather than signals. The blue, you might have seen the blue square with the yellow triangle in it. I think it's that way around. And therefore exceeded what's called its movement authority. Basically, it's a SPAD. It's the equivalent of a SPAD, basically. So that was the kind of the first of the causal factors, because of the lack of wheel rail adhesion. The next one is the fact that the wheel rail adhesion was unable to support the required braking because sand was not being discharged. So there we go. So then you get the next causal factor. Well, that happened because of this. Then you see the next causal factor. So you see all the information, plenty of data here, by the way, about the low adhesion event, the weather, the varying sort of adhesion factors at play here. So lots of detail going on. You can see this analysis of the condition of the railhead in the immediate kind of aftermath of the accident, giving an idea of the condition of the railhead. So they can do testing of that fairly quickly. There's not visible contamination like oil or anything on the wheels. So so there's some sample collection going on actually on the day after the accident. So you can see they've actually collected some of that leaf mulch sort of scum to sort of look at what the conditions are. So let's go through all of this analysis, because that is obviously the key point. This is a major causal factor. The first one is like, well, it's quite simple. It went past the block marker. It did that because of a low adhesion event. And so here's all the analysis looking at that low adhesion event. And then the next one is, well, what about the systems that would prevent that low adhesion event? Well, there were the train-borne sanding systems. Well, they didn't mitigate it because the automatic sander was not working and the driver did not use the emergency sander. So the automatic sander didn't work and the emergency sander was not used. So again, it's like, well, okay, that then raises all these questions about, well, what was the condition of the automatic sander? Well, not so good. There are some blocked hoses, that kind of like, that's... the blocked hoses, and then the electrics seem to have had problems and not worked. So there's all the going in through all the various kind of technology, the isolation switch and all these problems. So you can see that all these issues with the low speed relay. So, the ability of an electrically active sander to clear a blocked delivery hose. So all this analysis to go through and pick up, all these details. And then the fact that the emergency sanding system was then not activated, and then some of the consideration of whether that would have stopped the train, and also what, you go into then understanding the driver training. So, the detail of that. Then the next causal factor, which is the approach speed of the train towards Juliet, we're going to call it now. The approach speed of Juliet towards the eastern entry to Talerddig Loop was such that the subsequently required deceleration could not be sustained with the available wheel rail adhesion. So basically the driver was going, or rather the driver had been given, it's not necessarily the driver controlled the train, was that it was really too fast for the conditions at that point. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's driver error. As we'll see, there are challenges here with the indications being given to the driver by the ETCS system, a system that is inherently saying, drive the way I'm telling you to drive, driver. Now, it's not necessarily that that's bad, but if you haven't got enough parameters, for example, to do with low adhesion, as is about to be demonstrated in this section, then that is potentially leading the driver to drive in a way that is not appropriate for the conditions. And yes, it is ultimately the case that the driver has to drive for the conditions, but if you're in a system that is telling you the way you're supposed to drive, then, behaviorally, ergonomically, the consequences are going to be different. So, you can see, so this is a lot of detail that goes into the speedometer, the sort of on-screen interface, if you like, the kind of the driver-machine interface, I believe it's called, that kind of gives information about, what's the speed the driver should be doing. And there's a lot of information there. There's a lot of detail here about the fact that you get pre-indications with kind of slight differences in color. You've got all sorts of different color changes. You've got color changes of yellow and then red, saying that there's an overspeed. As we'll go through, though, these aren't that clear, and the driver's understanding of these has been demonstrated as being not great. There's a good graphic here showing the different profiles of trains. The red is Juliet here, and you can see the difference. What stopping trains should have been doing and what continuing trains do. But this paragraph is key. The concept of a speed restriction warning masking notifications for the next one was identified during the early testing phases of the Cambrian ERTMS scheme, when the previous train operator was responsible for operating trains on the Cambrian lines. The Office of Rail and Road, the ORR, you're all familiar with the ORR, Google if you're not, raised concerns relating to this potentially causing drivers to mishandle trains and advised the project to avoid closely spaced cascading speed restrictions, a bit like these. RAIB has not been able to establish what action was taken, as there is no record of a formal response to this concern. See paragraph 411. So you can see the challenges here. The next one is, having passed the block marker, Juliet entered the unoccupied single line. This is kind of saying, well, no physical infrastructure was there to stop that happening. So no engineered mitigations. There's a bit more about that later on. And then the next one is beyond the block marker that the wheel rail adhesion was exceptionally low. So at this point, the train had it was a downhill, and there was no chance of the train managing to get adhesion with the railhead at this point. And then you can see lots more kind of analysis of that point. No engineered mitigations existed to prevent the train entering that occupied single line. Talking about traps, for example. This is an interesting one here. So signalling sketches provided by the Signalling Record Society show how the track layout at Talerddig has had many changes since the late 1800s. There were trap points that were provided in 1968. They were removed again in 1986 when the track layout was prepared for the re-signalling under RETB. And there were no changes then made when the ERTMS system was commissioned, although the points were converted to power operation in place of the train-operated points used under RETB. Because the use of trap points involves intentionally derailing rail vehicles, their use is limited to very specific circumstances. Now, I've already said this, so for the sake of time, I won't dwell on it, but that's why they were not installed. Understandably, were not installed here. Does that mean that there's a similar or alternative mitigation should have been applied here? That remains to be kind of assessed, really, but that's the reason why there wasn't a set of trap points there. We'll get to that momentarily. So there's a lot of information about the ERTMS. The next is then train Sierra was permitted to proceed to the end of its issued movement authority. That's the train going up the hill, the innocent train, if you like. And this is another interesting paragraph, right? So ERTMS does not incorporate a function to automatically send a stop command to trains with movement authorities already issued where the overrun is not in direct conflict with their route. Even though train 1 and Juliet 25 had entered the single line and was now foul of the single line, it had not passed it had not passed the previous block marker. So I'm not going to call it a signal. So it was not yet in conflict with the movement authority issued to train Sierra. The provision of a facility to automatically send a stop command to trains with a valid movement authority in the event of an overrun without a direct conflict. So that's basically saying, you're probably going to come into conflict in a minute, you should stop. It would be subject to a client requirement. What that's saying is that's not part of the baseline standard. You have to request that as an additional function, an additional feature with cost and complexity associated with it. This request would have originated from Network Rail, but was not made, so the facility was not provided on the Cambrian lines. There we go. So it's as simple as that. There's a bit of detail about the use of GSMR. That's the kind of universal sort of radio system that we have for contacts. A good bit of detail in here. An impact on collision speed, so a kind of a mitigating factor on that was the fact that there was a kind of a gel applicator located that was not operational that could have reduced the speed of the train had it been functioning. This is a lot of analysis they do to have a look at that. And also the use of adhesion modifiers by the railhead treatment train, which could have also been applied to potentially influence the overrun, if not get rid of it. They say it's very difficult to quantify its influence. And they talk about the fact that it is not used regularly, or in some instances is not used because there's a perception by some engineers that it actually attracts and sticks leaves to the railhead, and it doesn't let them blow off in wind, and therefore actually makes things worse. We'll come back to that later. And then there's a bit of kind of performance of the vehicle structures. Well, there was a loss of cab survival space on train Sierra. So the kind of the train coming up the hill, you can see the severe damage. The cab is basically compressed into very little space whatsoever. key thing, yeah, you can see how much the desk has been pushed right up against the. It's a small picture there. I know it's a bit of a postage stamp, but you can get the PDF yourselves. The desk has been pushed right into the where the driver would have been sat there. It's really not good at all. And so there's a couple of paragraphs here on crashworthiness. It's something that I care very much about. Well, much as I love the 158s, these also not great. They had to comply with a sequence of various standards, but the standards they had to comply with gave forces that the cab had to survive, but not given collision scenarios, as modern crashworthiness standards have to. So yeah, this was one of the first application of welded aluminium in UK train construction, and so a lot of work went into understanding its performance, and British Rail in 1989 concluded this. The Class 158 is not a good crashworthy structure. High force levels and low energy absorption at low impact velocities are evident, with deceleration levels approximately twice the suggested values. What that's saying is the train's too rigid and there are no energy absorbing features, which means that a lot of force spikes into that cab, resulting in high forces for the driver and also high forces for the components, which can fail, resulting in a loss of cab space. So in 1991, the 158 cab structure was crash tested in a controlled environment. British Rail concluded that the energy absorbed by the cab ends in the test was sufficiently high to meet British Rail's latest standard, but the peak forces generated during the test were much higher than in comparable steel vehicles, and the mode of deformation rather aggressive. Steel is better at crumpling than aluminium. So now that we have other sort of FEM design, we can do a better job of that. See also the 810 and how well it performed in the Bedford crash, but aluminium extruded in this way for the construction of the 158s turns out doesn't perform that well. So yeah, the cab not great to be in one of those. And yeah, Rigor Mortis 69 pointing out these blunt-ended trains have little space to play with to add crash structures. Absolutely. And then the performance of interior fittings as well. So saloon tables. And there's always a chat about seat belts, and that's worth just picking out the fact that the RAIB believes that the RSSB's post after NERVIT justification for not fitting seat belts is no longer supported by the fact that modern trains are better at not losing cabin space. Greyrig, for example, and Talerddig both, the passenger cabin stayed largely intact because of stronger trains, but that means that the forces were higher and also the logic of seatbelts being that they allow people to move around inside a squishing train doesn't apply. If the train isn't squishing, people are just flying around. Does that mean that seatbelts being fitted is actually a good idea? Well, there are lots of reasons for that not to be the case. So, performance of interior doors, access panels that were causing problems for the emergency services, some of the things, and then underlying factors, which are very important as well. Underlying factors such as the fact that there was a long-standing misalignment between the system safety models used for the Camry ERTMS signalling system and Class 158 rolling stock. So there is a kind of a fundamental disconnect between those two those two systems, the train and the system controlling the train, which is, not ideal. I think the 3 paragraphs here that really summarise this. Trains on the Camry lines are not expected to overrun their movement authority based on the stated maximum allowable rate for an exceedance of the permissible speed or distance. So basically, the system is designed on they will never overrun. This, however, requires constant supervision of trains operating under ETCS to prevent such overruns. So, that means that any train operation is therefore critically dependent on the train's ability to control its speed and stop within the distances adopted by the signalling system design. The train's ability to deliver such control is, in turn, dependent on a sufficient wheel rail adhesion level. And the accident at Talerddig demonstrates that the 158, in the way that it was being maintained, could not provide the sufficient wheel rail adhesion levels. So there is a fundamental mismatch in risk management between the ERTMS assumptions and the capability of the 158. Really important systems failure there. Kind of arguably the most fundamental failure, I would say. These 3 paragraphs really represent the major failure in what happened at Talerddig, really. Assurance of automatic sander operation. So TfW's processes intended to ensure the operation of the automatic sanding system were not sufficiently effective. Yep. TfW did not have a full understanding of the RTMS system and its drivers' interactions with it, which is a probable underlying factor. So this is a kind of a key paragraph as well here. The nature of in-cab signaling systems such as ETCS means that to fully exploit the advantages of in-cab signaling while avoiding kind of SPADs, basically. What is the SBI? Someone in the chat will tell me what an SBI is, but basically I think that's like an intervention of the system, perhaps, or an automatic, maybe it's an emergency brake. Drivers will focus on the DMI, that's the screen, and keep close to the speed indications it provides. This contrasts with conventionally signaled lines, where drivers must use their route knowledge and the information provided by signs and signals to plan ahead and control their speed appropriately. This change in emphasis may mean that drivers operating with in-cab signaling systems are less aware of upcoming changes, such as being routed into a loop, where the diverging route has a lower line speed. This is supported by a survey which RAIB undertook of drivers on the Cambrian lines who reported that they felt too little information was provided by the screen, the ERTMS screen, about the route their train would take at stations, junctions, and passing loops. Academic research suggests that more information provided in the planning area could assist drivers in developing more effective driving strategies. Absolutely. So had the driver known inherently that they were going into the loop, they may have been approaching at a lower speed to manage the consequences of that. Yes, so... Doug Pally, thank you so much for the £10. Hi, Gareth, and thanks for what you do. The emergency action signs on trains are all based around being mobile. No instructions for people who can't. Are we left to last for the fire and rescue services to evacuate? Often and uncomfortably, the assumption is, the people in the wheelchairs, they'll just kind of wheel themselves into a little safe area and we'll just come and get them later. Yes. And I just continue to not think. Service brake intervention. Thank you, Smitty91260. Yeah, service brake interaction. So basically like an automatically applied brake application. Doug, it's a very point, and I think we continue to not do a good enough job there. And again, it's just like get disabled people involved early doors with the design rather than it being an afterthought would solve a lot of those problems. RIB also found there was confusion over the different warning colours attached to the speed hook, with some drivers unaware of the existence of the orange colour. This indicates a lack of complete knowledge of the system by some drivers. In addition, research suggests there's little to no difference in the connotation of these colours, given that white, yellow, or orange can signify a warning. A lack of discriminability between these similar colours could also potentially create confusion. Research also shows that if the system is not transparent or explicit, drivers may find it difficult to form a complete, accurate, and effective mental model to support them in the driving task. Principles of good display design also include the importance of minimizing perceptual confusion and the need to make the discrimination of modes as visible as possible by employing salient and visual cues. This lack of understanding of the different colors of the speed hook highlights the importance of effective training to ensure drivers fully understand system-generated warnings. However, TfW lacked the detailed knowledge of the operation of the system to be able to provide the necessary information to the required depth to drivers. That's scathing. Basically, drivers not having a full understanding of the system that they were using to drive trains. Really quite brutally scathing. And so then the other issue was the fact that TfW were not training their drivers sufficiently to prepare them to respond appropriately in an emergency situation in the cab. And there's a paragraph here that I want to read. When the ERTMS system was initially implemented on the Cambrian lines, a Class 158 cab simulator was provided by Network Rail to facilitate driver training. This simulator fell into disuse and was subsequently decommissioned. The loss of this simulator removed a potential tool which could maintain driver skills and knowledge when faced with out-of-course and emergency situations such as those encountered by the driver of train Juliet approaching Talerddig. The simulator may also have been useful to refresh drivers on the masking effect, which may affect warnings on the screen, had this issue been fully understood by TfW. So a serious failure there of the railway. Network Rail did not have a detailed understanding of the effectiveness of wheel rail adhesion modifiers. This is a possible underlying factor. A common theme reported by seasonal delivery staff was a lack of clear guidance on the effectiveness of adhesion modifiers. So things that shoot gel or paste onto the head of the rail to improve how sticky the rail is to the wheel of trains passing over. Although most seasonal delivery staff reported good formal and informal means of getting advice and support, several reported a lack of knowledge about the performance of adhesion modifiers. One person stated that they believed that the decision not to use adhesion modifiers was sometimes based on a feeling within a route or the opinion of influential staff. And now the next one to kind of compound onto this was that Network Rail's seasonal delivery team for the Wales and Borders route was operating with reduced resources, and the seasonal delivery manager role had no formal competency framework. Although the absence of staff resources had meant there was reduced capacity to explore new developments, the overall approach to seasonal management was compliant with Network Rail standards. This is such a classic Network Rail line. So there were lack of staff to actually think about the future and maybe prepare and do research, but they were enough to just keep on top of the role as required by the bare minimum as required by standards, is what that first sentence says. It's painful. RIB found no evidence that these resourcing issues created the conditions for the Talerddig accident to occur, or of any concerns being identified by other rail industry parties working within the Wales Borders route. regarding Network Rail's preparedness for the 2024 autumn leaf fall season. So resourcing not regarded as being a factor. But I think it's worth saying that, like, yeah, but had we been using better technologies or had a better understanding of the technology, we could have been better at preventing the low adhesion event in the first place. Some members of TFW staff had received no training on the emergency equipment provided on their train. So there was a driver, a guard, and a host. And the guard and host were not regarded as safety critical staff. The host of the train was not regarded as safety critical staff and had not received any form of training to cover actions which could be required in the event of an emergency. This is why all the staff on the train have to be safety critical, because they can all act if there is an emergency. So yeah, rightly the unions will be picking up on that one, I suggest. Yeah, that's a very interesting line, that one. Yes. Other defects in the sanding systems. Low sand delivery rates can reduce the potential benefits provided by train-borne sanding systems. So there's a bit of information about sanding rates here. Now, the last one is that the ORR gets its own little section here, the actions of the Safety Authority, for which I'm going to refer to just one paragraph here, which is, I think, a little bit instructive about the conditions of the ORR. Although ORR supplied RAIB with a significant quantity of documentation about its certification of the Cambrian Line's ERTMS project, most of the relevant documents from the period from 2012 to 2022 were missing. ORR explained that this was due to an issue with the computer-based storage system in 2017, which had resulted in the loss of many documents. From the remaining documents, it was not apparent how any concerns about the specific issues raised were resolved. The previous few pages talk about issues raised in the deployment of ERTMS here. Additionally, no references were found to any considerations of the reliability or performance of the automatic sanding systems fitted to ERTMS-equipped Class 158 units. Yes. So, let us jump then to sort of summarising those conclusions again for the benefit of those who are perhaps jumping in. So the immediate factor was the fact that the train passed its authorised stopping position, entered a single line occupied section occupied by the train Sierra and walloped into it. The causal factors were that the train was unable to stop at the block marker where it was supposed to, because the wheel rail adhesion was unable to support the required braking. The sanding on the train didn't help. It didn't function or wasn't operated, and the approach speed was too high for the conditions. And then, having passed the block marker, it went into the single line section. The wheel rail adhesion was even worse, so there was no chance of reducing its speed, and there were no engineering mitigations to prevent the train entering that single line section. So those are the causal factors. Those kind of A and B with some splits leading into it. So you start to see the kind of that tree, you know, the factor tree there leading to the failure. And then we've gone through, you know, the factors affecting the severity of consequences are that, you know, Train Sierra there was no system to stop Train Sierra earlier. There was a traction gel applicator that was not operational. The use of an adhesion modifier delivered by the railhead treatment train wasn't happening. It was not operating. There was a loss of cab survival space because of lack of crashworthiness in the 158s. Interior fittings in the train were not ideal. And indeed, the external access panels caused problems, or internal access panels caused problems as well. And we've gone through those underlying factors and observations as well. So